So as you're coming in, it's going to be the yellow slip of paper on the feedback form. It asks for title. I've cleverly chosen the longest title of all the presentations. Make sure you get it all in there completely. Or just write DQs, that's good enough too. Oh, absolutely. Yes.
See, but then it might get confused with Dairy Queen.
Right. Preston, is there a range where I'm out of the camera view that I have to stay out of or prefer to hang out of?
If you start getting behind the audience, you're
Okay. All right. Noted. Yes. It's a plan. I'm going to get this from the far back of the room by the bar with a bottle of whiskey in my hand. We'll make do.
As long as you don't forget Jason. Jason's the benchmark.
And Jonathan, I hope I don't overlap with you too much. I got one slide on the jar. Okay. Okay. Again, will be the yellow feedback form. Yellow. Yep. You want to tape that right on me so we can?
All right, yep, right on you.
All right.
Or maybe on the corner of the screen there might work as well, unless you want to just put it on your shirt.
I think it'd be more entertaining for the audience at home.
Right.
Should be awesome. Okay. Yep, she's going to split the, maybe the other room.
We're giving them all this presentation.
Right.
Doesn't matter what they're talking about. They're giving this. I'm going to help you out.
Okay.
No, I'm not. You can disqualify me.
Done. Done.
Yeah, I've got his notes.
No. No one ever is. Why start now? I'd be uncomfortable. I'd be uncomfortable with that. And you're awesome at it.
Balls for you and everything.
You are the best at blocking the scorekeeper. Phenomenal. If we could DQ people for annoying the scorekeeper, you know how much paperwork I would have filled out? Right?
Myself probably included. That's where it gets interesting.
Right. We're there? All right, folks. We'll get settled in. See, this is the difficult presentation. I'm sure they no doubt specifically slotted me for this. We're all full from nice baked potato lunch, right? We're all drifting off trying to take a nap. So clearly we need the most exciting, enthusiastic topic and presenter we can have. Those who know me know we're doomed, right? For those who don't know me, my name is Mike Ames. I'm a level 2 out of Sherman, Texas, which is about an hour north of Dallas. Part of the reason I'm giving this presentation, I've been doing tournament organization, judging, things like that for a variety of games for almost 20 years now. Started out with the old Decipher Star Wars game. Yes, woo. Thank you, somebody, for acknowledging that. Got into Magic judging about 10 years ago. But the old adage, I've seen a lot of things, right? Just to kind of get a feel for the room, who has had to DQ somebody? Okay, so for those who can't see on the camera at home, that's about 1/10 of the room, okay? Now have your hand up if you've DQ'd 5 or more folks. Okay, now we're down to 4 people out of 4 or 5 people. 10 or more. Okay, it's Alex and I. High five, Alex, right? Again, and I'm sure Alex will acknowledge, this is not a statistic we're proud of in the slightest, right? This is some of these.
We may deserve it.
Yes, right. It's for those who've never had to give a DQ, it's not something you want to do. A number of things can go wrong, make things more difficult. We're going to try to talk through some of that today. Fortunately for you, I've seen a lot of things, dealt with a lot of stuff, try to get you prepared for these things if they tend to happen to you coming up forward, right? So overview of the topics we'll discuss. What kind of actions constitute getting a DQ? How do we currently process DQs? How to gather your info, write your report, dealing with some of the difficult players in those situations. What happens in the process once you've filled out all the paperwork? What's going to happen downstream from that? Why it's important to enforce DQs. couple slides on that, kind of why are we doing philosophy and things like that. Dealing with some of those difficult TO situations. Hibbs kind of alluded to that during his Boy Scout speech, that there are going to be some times where TO kind of says, hey, is this really that big of a deal? It happens more than we'd like to admit. Give you some ammunition to deal with those TOs when those situations come up. And some time at the end for questions and discussion if we need it. So a couple disclaimers. First of all, as I mentioned, I'm old. The crux of this is going to be telling some stories of some of these DQs we've dealt with, right? If it becomes too much of an issue, Ben's been the volunteer. If I get in too much into old man storytelling mode, Ben will yell at me to shut up, we'll move on, right? But again, openly welcome anyone with time left, give stories about some of the DQs they've had, questions, things like that to get into. But hopefully we can all learn from some of the experiences I've had. The other disclaimer, more sports ball, right? For those who had my work presentation about a year ago, we filled that with lots of cute pictures of cats from the internet. This time we're going the other direction with sports. So whether it's relevant or some of these are some of the more relevant cheating moments in sports. So whether it help hopefully tie in some of the DQ related terminology, but also maybe gives you some ammunition to talk to the sports fans in the rest of your life if that's not you currently. All right, so we'll start out with some of the actions that would constitute a DQ at regular rel, right? And this is verbatim from the jar, right? We got a bullet on aggressive, violent, or abusive behavior, whether it's physical or verbal, intentionally and knowingly, and keyword there being intentionally and knowingly, right? Breaking or letting an opponent break game or tournament rules or lying, right? And all that's going to be tying into getting an advantage. Third bullet, determining match outcomes by incentives, coercion, or outside the game methods, gambling on any part of the tournament, right? So what we think about randomizing a match outcome, things like that. A lot of these things we proactively address during our opening announcements. Some of them we don't, like theft. We all feel we probably don't need to remind our players not to steal stuff from the store, right? Oddly, probably about a quarter of the DQs I've dealt with, not necessarily personally as a head judge, but in other events, have dealt with theft. And you'll notice it's just one bullet, one word, one bullet, right? So it can be a big factor. It's going to happen more often than any of us would really like. So we start looking at it in competitive rel, what competitive rel documentation says about that. Again, this is strictly out of the jar, but largely they tie it all into unsporting conduct, and it's pretty much the exact same stuff, just with a little more detail. And this chart's taken directly out of the IPG. You're going to see it's the same type of things, right? Improperly determining a winner, rolling a dice, playing Axis and Allies to determine a game of Magic, right? Don't recommend that. Bribery and wagering, aggressive behavior, theft of tournament material, stalling, cheating, right? All the same types of unwanted behaviors that we had in a regular rel, just more detail in IPG. Please. Oh, please. Okay. Excellent question, right? Nick, do you want to take that for me? So the question, just so I can make sure everyone on the stream can hear, the question was what's the difference between stalling and slow play? So Nick, do you want to take that one? Yes. Right. Yep. Right. So, yep. So for those who are on the stream, Nick had a great answer there. Stalling is intentionally doing it. If we back up a slide, we're intentionally and knowingly creating an advantage by using the clock. Here's where I get into story mode. This is a story I hadn't planned on telling. Are we all familiar with Jason the Mind Sculptor? Right? Okay, right? A couple of people know exactly the story we're getting into here, right? I think it was day 2 of her pro tour. We have a particular player who's running multiple copies of Jason the Mind Sculptor in their own deck, right? We're running towards time in the round. I'm sure I'm not remembering the details correctly, but this one particular player who's down a game in the match, was it 3 or 4 times they had to read Jason the Mind Sculptor? Every turn, right? They're running it, the pro tour, day 2, they have to read multiple times the abilities of the card they're playing in their own deck, right? That really starts making you ask a question about intent, right? So clearly they're manipulating the clock for their advantage. Yes?
In a situation like that, how do you work with the he said, she said? Like, how would you deal with that person claiming that, well, I really did need to, like, confirm what the card did?
Excellent question. So for those on the stream, the question was how do we deal with he said, she said, kind of the investigation and talking through all that. If I can put that question off for a couple more slides, we'll get to that in the we got a section on investigation, trying to dig out through that information. Okay, one more question, and we'll move on, please.
Okay, so this was actually broached in like a group I'm in on Facebook by LQT.
Okay.
And my previous understanding of a DQ for like at a regular event for improperly determining the outcome of a match is like, say you got little Johnny Magic and he says, let's roll a die to see who wins.
Right.
At that moment, my previous understanding was little Johnny Magic is DQ. This LQT says, okay, the verbiage we have here says determining the outcome by outside means.
Right.
In which case, just asking the question is not determining the outcome. How do you?
Okay, so the question, again, repeating that for the folks on the stream, is how we, in the specific offering of rolling a die to determine a winner versus actually committing the act, right? Thank you, first of all, for asking that very difficult question on the stream for me to turn red and try to answer here. It's one we can't take lightly and sweep under the rug, right? My understanding, and here's where I'll go and throw myself out there. I'm not as active in the judge community as I have been in the past. The latest understanding I have, and I'm hoping maybe Alex or Jonathan can correct me here if I'm a little outdated, the act of offering to commit this is enough to do, and I'm getting nods from the room, right? Right, showing the intent to break this rule is intent enough where they've committed the violation, right? Okay. Is this, yes, so quick point.
Going off of that same thing, do you also wait to see what their opponent does if they agree to DQ them also?
My opinion, so the question was, if offer has been made, do we wait for the opponent to react and try to break the rules and whatnot? Personally, I'm much more forefront. If we can help anybody not break these rules, I'd much rather jump in and try to prevent it. I'm not a fan of entrapment, trying to set people up to commit failure. Basically, if that comes along the line, and I'll kind of also go in that met, if we think they don't know the rules, that kind of, it's, again, this all has to be knowingly breaking the rules, right? Regardless, this die rolling, please, thank you. Yeah. Right. Right. Right.
There is a little bit of judgment call, but once they toss that die, it's too late to do anything. If
Right.
you get in there and educate them before they roll, there is some judgment call in them to whether you disqualify them.
Right. So echoing that point on the stream, Jonathan said the die rolling is the exception to the intentionally and knowingly, and that ties in more to gambling regulations and things at a Hasbro level than what we have in the game. So we'll need to move on a little bit, make sure we keep time here. So a couple more general notes on DQs, things pulled out of some of the documents. Yeah? Okay. Mm-hmm. Okay. So if we, tying into what Jonathan said, the question was, what if we have a brand new player, hasn't known any better, and things like that, right? I'm going to defer most of that question to a later slide I have. But again, as Jonathan said, this is a rule we have to enforce clearly across the board, despite who we have, right? No. Yes, right. So we'll have that on a couple slides here. Again, I appreciate all the feedback and timing here. I'm probably going to plow through a couple of these slides. These are great questions and great conversations we love to have. Like to make sure we should have plenty of time for those at the end. If they're germane to what we have on the slide, please raise your hand, but we'll probably, for some of those more specific type questions that aren't necessarily pertaining to a topic, we'll try to catch those up at the end, please. Okay. So a couple more notes pulled from some of the Wizards documentation, right? And this is one we'll go through on a couple more slides. Philosophy-wise in the IPG, we mentioned giving disqualifications for activity that damages the integrity of a tournament, right? We'll get into what that means in a quick second. DQs can be applied to multiple roles in a tournament. It can be to a player, a judge, a TO. Back when we had the Judge Center, when you filled out the disqualification paperwork in there, it defaulted to the role of the person you're disqualifying being the tournament organizer. You actually had to go in the drop box and tell Judge Center that they're not actually the TO, that you're actually disqualifying a player, right? Part of that was to get your attention, make sure you're putting the correct answer in there. But again, it kind of highlights, we often think we're disqualifying a player. Quite often it ends up being a spectator or somebody who's not actually directly involved in the match that we're dealing with, right? So if we do have to disqualify someone, they are immediately removed from the tournament. No additional prizes won. If they've already won something, they get to keep that. Nothing additional won, and they don't get any Planeswalker points for that tournament. So you may be asking, what do we do about standings? So if it's like a game day where we have prizes for the top 8, if they were in 6th place, at to the point where we're going to reward prizes, we'll shift everybody else up. So whoever would have been 7th, 8th, and 9th will be shifted up in terms of prizes. But an important bullet point here, if a DQ happens after we make a cut to say top 8 or top 4, we don't move anybody up to replace those people, right? So if we've already cut to top 8 and we have to disqualify player number 7, we don't move up player number 9 and number 8 to make room for somebody, okay? All right. When we do have disqualification, we have to enter that. The head judge or the scorekeeper will enter that in the penalties tab and Word, along with the additional reporting, which we'll get to in a couple slides. Okay. There we go. So delving a little more into the details of tournament integrity compromise, right? What that means. So give an example of my first 2 disqualifications, right? Happened at a pre-release. It was in a storefront that was specifically game space, right? Very little retail. We just sell snacks, drinks, and a couple clearance board games, okay? Entire spaces for gaming. We had 2 players constructing their pre-release decks at an 8-foot table. For those kind of new to Magic judging, a big transformation in your judge history happens when you realize 6-foot tables and 8-foot tables are units of measurement. It becomes part of your vernacular, right? The knowledgeable folks nodding and smiling. I mentioned that because an 8-foot table, if that doesn't mean much to you, that's normally 3 matches, 6 players can be comfortably at an 8-foot table, right? Having 2 players only building an 8-foot table, plenty of room, right? So I'm walking along after we've handed out product. People have shredded everything already. They're building their decks. I see one of the players at that table taking a card out of their pool, handing it to another player, and putting it in his pool. Okay? Come over there, ask what's going on. They say they didn't know it was a problem. They hand the card back. So I go and ask, is this the only card? Have you handed any other cards over? Because again, at this point, I'm willing to maybe accept they didn't know, even though I had actually made an announcement, they can only build with the cards in your pool, right? Nope, that's the only card. You sure that's the only card? It's the only card. So what Jonathan will get to in his talk on regular rel, a lot of times if we believe players and we can try to fix the problem, we'll break in there right away, try to find the best solution possible, right? Just looking at their piles, I could tell the one player had considerably more cards than the other. The way I chose to handle it may not have been the right way, but I walked away for a couple minutes. I figured if they're telling the truth, and if we were going to try to reconstruct it, if I walk away and they maybe sort their piles back out into what they had, it's probably going to be closer to getting to the tournament integrity than anything that I could do. I walk away, they do nothing. They don't fix their piles. I'm trying to give them the opportunity to fix it themselves. I come back over, count the one player's pile. In this particular pool, they should have had about 85 cards that were non-basics, 6 packs plus a pre-release card. The one player had over 100 cards, including all of the non-multicolored red cards out of both players' pools. So somebody want to tell me what kind of infractions we have here? Lying to a judge, right? Very clearly asked, is this the only card that has transferred pools? It clearly wasn't. Anything else that we've done? Cheating, right? At this point, when we first had the discussion about building their own pools, we could have corrected it. But certainly they knew at this point what was wrong and made no effort to correct that, right? So as we tie this back into tournament integrity, it's important to the tournament, unfortunately, that we have to remove these folks, because if we allowed that pool to stand in the tournament, anyone who plays against either of those pools at this point and if they lose, they're going to be questioning, how did you let this pool stand in the tournament, right? So something to keep in mind there. So at that point, that's when they were arguing. They didn't know, further that they didn't know they could separate the pools. They also said they didn't have enough room to build their decks on their 8-foot table made for 6 people, right? At that point, clearly, we're in the DQ realm. So walking through the current DQ process, now that Judge Center's down, a couple things have changed with the filing of the paperwork, but actually handling it during the tournament is pretty much the same. Number one bullet I can give you is to keep the tournament going, right? Quite often as a head judge, especially when you're giving your first DQ, you're going to get tunnel vision, just dealing with that one player or the person you have to disqualify. But it's important to make sure everything else keeps on track. So if you have other judges working with you, if you can delegate other tasks to other floor judges, that's fine. Great thing to do. If you're judging alone, make sure everything else gets taken care of, right? Hibbs did a great job at talking about everyone we're serving during a tournament. I'm not going to say we treat anybody differently during a disqualification process, but to be honest with you, as soon as I start suspecting that somebody's going down this realm, I'm still a little bit more concerned about everybody who's doing everything right in the tournament than I am about dealing with the person who's gone and violated the tournament rules, right? So it's important we keep everything else moving at that same time. So we're going to conduct our investigation, collect all the information. We'll get into more details on that in some more slides. Once we decide we're disqualifying the player, we have to notify them. We're also going to want to notify the TO or the store owner if possible, if they're around. We'll enter the DQ and we remove the player from the event, and then we complete and file all the paperwork. Again, more details are coming up in a couple slides. So more details on investigations. Again, I've just got a couple bullet points here. There's been a number of great presentations at other judge conferences about conducting investigations. Quite often they can be their own hour-long topics or more. David Hibbs gave a great one in Austin a couple of years ago. Highly suggest you go and look that up. But a couple bullet points. The intent, what we're trying to get out of a good investigation is all the information that we need to determine if there's been an infraction and what the penalty will be if there is, right? So we're going to want to talk with relevant players, other judges, any other witnesses, and players. The most recent DQ I did, I had a player raise her hand while I'm giving announcements for the last round of Swiss. I'm in the middle of my announcements. Jared, who's doing all the testing right now, in the middle of my announcements, raises his hand. Mike, we got something to deal with over here, right? So quite often, don't forget that there are players sitting around next to the match who may have heard things as well. So as you're asking questions of the people directly involved in the match, know that you can probably get information from other people that might have heard as well, right? Other bullet point, it's okay for us judges to get outside assistance, right? We know our players can't, but we have a lot of technology these days. If there's any questions about, is this really feel like a DQ or whatnot, we have our judge Slack in the South, right? There's a couple other means. Most of us have other judges who we have capability to text message or call real quick. If you need another opinion, go ahead and get it. And we're seeing a lot of good activity on this in our Slack, on the SOS channel. There's been a couple questions the last couple weeks. Hey, I think I got to DQ somebody. Does this feel right, right? So know that that's there. You don't need to make the decision in a vacuum. Okay? The IPG tells us direct evidence is not necessary. The head judge has the responsibility to try to figure out if they believe their integrity has been compromised, if they feel somebody's intentionally cheating, or if conduct's been severe enough to determine that we need a DQ, right? So the whole investigation process, it can be just a minute long. Sometimes it takes multiple rounds, right? One of the things we quite often hear, like when Hibbs gave his talk about investigations, he said it's hardly ever you got it under a minute somebody says, yes, I cheated. Again, I've been around, seen a whole lot. I've had one of those. It was an F&M, a modern tournament. Young gentleman playing Infect. It's round 4. He's got a 3-0 record. Game 2, he's up a game. Floor judge comes up to me. I've got something here, Mike, I'm not quite sure how to handle. He tells me Infect player's resolving a fetch land. Opponent says he thinks he saw a card go from the deck into the player's hand while he's resolving the fetch land. Come over there, ask the players. So here's what my floor judge told me, resolving a fetch, card ends up there. The player being questioned about this, like, yep, that's what happened. Okay, do you know which card it was? Become immense. Okay, can I talk to you away from the table for a second, right? Because I'm thinking this is still going to be a much more difficult discussion. Give me just one quick second to finish this up, right? So I kind of asked to step away. So why did you do that? Oh, I was cheating. All right. We got some paperwork to fill out. Yes, miss. Mm-hmm. Sure. So the question, and I'll let Josh get to this, or correct me if, let me just repeat that for the camera. The question was, can there be some leniency shown? Do we have anything in the documentation? Am I restating that correctly? If someone's owning up to it right away, is there anything in place for that? So let me try to answer it first, Josh, if that's okay. Because, again, you know what, Josh, I'm going to let you take this then. Go ahead.
Okay, as far as leniency from us, on the disqualification, there is none.
Right.
They are disqualified. Leniency comes into account through the investigation committee. And if you put in your report, they owned up to it, they were apologetic, they were personal, you know, like that. Like one of my DQs, he apologized multiple times over that. And I put that in my report. That he showed remorse. He did not get a suspension. Same day, the other person showed zero remorse. I put that in my report. He got a suspension. So that is something that the investigation committee takes into account. That's not something that we take into account. It's sort of kind of like a cop versus the judge. You know,
Yes.
the judge takes that into account.
Right. So restating that for the camera and also kind of padding on to what Josh said. So the rule's been violated. We have to enforce the rule. The leniency comes in dealing with the investigation committee, possible suspensions and bannings, right? Echoing Josh's point, and again, you guys are doing a great job of catching my later bullets here, which is great. We're going to make the second half of this is going to fly by, but I'm glad we're touching on the points while we can. That's exactly what we did in this case. In my head judge report on the investigation, I wrote, as soon as it was called on it, admitted to it, told us exactly what happened, answered all the questions truthfully and honestly, right? I've had very similar thing happen with die rolling, right? I've had player offer the die roll, player accept the die roll, right? Two completely different stories, one person completely contrite, one person swearing at me thinking I'm taking it personally, right? In our whole talk, and then their own witness statements that get put in the investigation reflected that as well, right? Two different suspensions on it. Right? So if they are contrite, as Josh said, put it in the head judge notes. Nick?
On the taking multiple rounds, are you able to retroactively DQ somebody?
Yes. Well, not quite retroactively, and I think I've got the bullet elsewhere on the slide. The question was, with multiple rounds, can we do it later in the event? It's yes. So if event's already been closed and uploaded, we can still issue a DQ. Here I am getting into old man mode. There's a DQ I should have given. I was a fairly young judge at the time, and I didn't go through with it. I probably should have. Again, F&M, where we give out a pack per match win, and this is in the older days of stores getting 4 F&M promo cards, 2 give out to the top 2, 2 given out randomly, right? We had enough players to where we would undoubtedly have 3 or more undefeated players at the end, right? So what I find out at the end of the tournament, 2 of my players were buddies. They had played in round 3. They had actually played 3 games. They recorded the slip as 2-0, right? The player I hear this from is a judge. He wasn't judging in that tournament, but I hear this after it's all been entered. I can't figure out why in the heck they did it, right? It's like, so I handle it in my redneck shoot from the hip kind of way. I take him out in the parking lot and yell at him like, dude, you're a judge, you know better than this, blah, 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 right? Driving home is when I realized why they did it. Game win percentage is second tiebreaker, I believe. So by him winning 2-0, or by his buddy winning 2-0 instead of 2-1, improved his game win percentage, gave him a better chance of winning the foil, right? What penalty have we committed? We've committed fraud, right? We've lied. We've knowingly entered an incorrect result slip. So not only is it possible to DQ, that's what I should have done, right? What was the question? What was the promo? It was. It absolutely was not worth it. It might have been Wild Mongrel. I'm not sure. It wasn't great, right? So great conversations again, and I don't mind losing time on this because this is time we're going to spend later on in the slides. Good conversations to have. Appreciate it. So bottom line, what it's going to come down to, as we said, you don't have to have direct evidence, but if you're in the head judge role, you've got to be able to convince yourself, does this person need to be removed from the tournament? Do they still belong in the tournament? And tying in with that earlier question, very separate things. Disqualification is a complete different process from the investigation that goes into suspension and bannings, right? Head judge job, do they need to be removed from this tournament? We've provided all that information later on for the investigation committee, but if we can separate that, all the better. All right, so the first sports story. Rosie Ruiz, the marathon runner. Does anyone know the story of Rosie Ruiz and what she's famous for? Yeah, Subway, right? So for those not familiar, she is the one who was allegedly, who took the subway in the 1979 New York City Marathon, right? What a lot of people forget about this story, it wasn't caught in relation to the 1979 marathon, New York City Marathon. It was caught when she finished first in the 1980 Boston Marathon, right? People started asking questions when she won the Boston Marathon because newspaper reporters are coming up to her asking her running-related questions. She doesn't know any of the terminology. She doesn't know where splits were. Now, granted, you look at me, I don't know running terminology, but somebody who won the Boston Marathon, you expect to know what certain things are, right? Know some of the terminology, be able to converse like a marathon runner, right? So newspaper reporters were already immediately having questions about it, right? She wasn't sweating or breathing as heavily as you might expect for a marathon runner who just went 26.2 miles, right? Didn't quite look right. Next bullet point, she finished 25 minutes faster in the Boston Marathon than she did in the New York City Marathon. The New York City Marathon was the one that qualified her for Boston. And talking to my long-distance running friends, that's highly unusual to improve by 25 minutes within the span of a year, right? That set off a bunch of flags. The last bullet point, again, we talk about outside assistance, talking to spectators and things like that. There's one particular women's university that's along the Boston Marathon route. Being a women's university, they go crazy when the first pack of women runners come by, right? They've got water stations for them. They cheer like crazy. None of them remembered Rosie Ruiz going by, right? So they go and investigate that. They find she cheated in the Boston Marathon. That's when they go back later and find out she took the subway in the New York City Marathon too, right? So she's famous for having taken the subway in the New York City, but it all became apparent when they started investigating the Boston Marathon, right? So that's kind of highlights, hopefully, what we're trying to get through with investigations, right? Tying it into a magic example from SCG States a couple years ago where I was head judge. For those who have done competitive rel, last couple of years we've had less of an emphasis on counting the number of cards in the deck list because our high-level judges have told us there's a very little, there's not much of a correlation between an illegal deck list and outright cheating that we're going to find in doing a deck check, right? Again, old man, seen a lot. Here's an example of one perfect correlation, right? Jared again, he's my deck check team lead. Deck check teams finds a list with 59 cards registered in main deck. They do a deck check, game 1, round 2. First problem, they've got a double deck box. 2 decks in the same box, they're sleeved differently, but still a no-no, a competitive rel. But beyond that, there's extra copies of sideboard cards belonging to the deck that they're actually playing that aren't sleeved, okay? Problem number 2, there's sideboard cards in their main deck as they presented for game 1. So they've either pre-sideboarded or failed to de-sideboard. We start asking some of the questions, and this is the quote that stayed with me for the longest time. Why would I ever want 4 copies of Circle of Flame? Granted, I deal with statistics a lot in my daily work, but you don't have to be too much of a mathematician to know just simply, if you're trying to find 1 copy of Circle of Flame, you're going to be twice as likely to find it if you're running 4 copies than if you're running the 2 that they had registered, right? Still a problem. But again, it was a good argument he was trying to make, didn't quite sell me. What the investigation did come through, though, he did admit to intentionally pre-sideboarding. Walking around before the tournament and in game 1, he had seen a whole bunch of green decks. So he pre-sideboarded round 2 with cards anti-green, right? That right there is cheating. That led to the DQ. A big lesson learned in this, though, I took too much time letting this player provide excuses, right? Jared was great. Once he knew we were kind of in the DQ alley, he tapped me on the shoulder, said, take care of what you got to do here. I'll take care of the rest of the tournament, right? This conversation still took about 5 minutes longer than it needed to. At some point, sooner than what I did, I needed to have put my foot down and said, no, we can continue to talk. You're going to get the opportunity to fill out your statement, but nothing else is going to change from this point. I have to remove you from the tournament. I was too slow in doing that. I want to pass that part of the story along. Okay. So as far as gathering, yes. Mm-hmm.
Like this is just not a question, but like I don't know if I missed it for the 2 minutes I wasn't here. But did you happen to mention to everybody in the room what the definition of cheating is under the IPG?
So we did have that a couple slides ago. We can catch up on that afterwards if that's okay. Okay. So with Judge Center down, we have to collect information that goes into a Google form now that's linked on Judge Apps. Okay. We now require a little more information than we did in Judge Center. So I'm going to cheat and read it off the slide here because I'm still not caught up with it and I haven't had to fill out the Google form yet. But first thing we need is all the information on the disqualified person. Their name, DCI number, email address, their role in the tournament. Big thing I want to highlight here, email address, if they choose to provide it, make sure before they leave the venue that you can read their handwriting. Everything else here you can get from Word. If you can't read their email address, you've just lost the ability for Wizards to be able to communicate with them. So make sure you double check that. If you're DQing a player because of something that happened during a match, we now collect the opponent's name, DCI number, and email address. So if Wizards has to ask any, or the investigation committee needs to ask any questions, they're able to do that now. That's new since. Yep. I haven't seen the form yet. My opinion, more information that you give the investigation committee, the better, right? So it's going to take longer to collect. If you can do it and still keep the tournament all running, at least collect the minimum that it took. But the more information you give the investigation committee, the better. Yes? Okay, excellent. So the question was, what if they outright refuse to give you any type of information? So we've got two avenues for that. And again, we're reading a couple slides ahead, which is awesome. We have a sheet of paper, which is called the Player Disqualification FAQ, right? It has contact information for them to give, or to give to them. If they don't want to provide you with any of this stuff, it gives them people they can provide that to later on. So if they're yelling and screaming at you, and I've had this where they're yelling and screaming and don't want to talk to you, say, hey, give me 30 seconds. I'll print off all the information you need to talk to everybody, to provide your story, to gripe about me. Anybody who you might need to talk to will be on this sheet of paper. That's usually enough to settle the conversation right there. Okay? So we've got a whole other litany of information. Shortcutting it here, need the type of event. You can get all that type of stuff from Word. You need your own head judge statement, right? You're going to write up what happened, and now the Google form asks you, do you think they knew they committed an infraction? Important note I would suggest on the head judge statements, make sure you do this in a vacuum. You're going to collect everybody else's statements, witness statements, other judges' statements. Don't let any of that influence your own head judge statement. So as you collect all that, keep it segregated. Don't let it bias you. Yes, Josh?
What I recommend is doing all of, like, writing out your statement and all of the information that from you first before reading anybody else's stuff. Because if you think you're going to be impartial, once you've read, one of the player's statements, your personal information in your brain has been contaminated.
Right.
So try to do it before you read anybody else's statement.
Absolutely. Thank you, Josh. So again, speeding kind of along here, catching up on time, dealing with difficult players. Love the Simpsons reference. Marge, you're only hearing what you want to hear. Homer, thanks, I love an omelet right about now. You will deal with players who want to have nothing to do with this conversation, right? Second sports analogy, George Brett and the Pine Tar incidents. George Brett, Hall of Fame baseball player. Royals are trailing the Yankees 4-3, 2 outs, top of the ninth. George Brett hits a 2-run homer, giving the Royals the lead. The Yankees manager, Billy Martin, challenges the amount of pine tar that's on George Brett's bat. Pine tar being a sticky substance, give you more grip on the bat. You can only have so much of the length of the bat covered with that pine tar material. Billy Martin challenges that, right? So here we have Billy Martin clearly, calmly discussing that with the umpire, right? Long story short, Tim McKellen decides, yep, too much pine tar on there, calls George Brett out. That ends the game because it's the last out. Invalidates the home run, Yankees win, right? George Brett decides he wants to have a little bit of the conversation there, right? Calmly. Right? Further calm discussion ensues. I love the headlock of the umpire here, right? I've seen a lot of things in Magic. Thankfully, haven't seen anything get to this point, right? It may happen someday. We've had a lot of players get very argumentative. We've had threats of lawsuit, things like that. Hopefully it never gets this bad. We talk about appeals, right? Head judge is the last word at a tournament. There's an appeals system. There's an investigation committee that looks at things beyond that. George Brett, despite being a Hall of Famer, and pretty much exclusively known for this incident and that reaction, right? What we forget about this is that the Royals appealed. Major League Baseball overturned the penalty. They actually had the Royals and Yankees get back together, restated the home run, gave the Royals a 5-4 lead, and made them pick it up from 2 outs in the top of the 9th. Royals went on to win the replayed game, right? Again, forgotten part of history here, but there is even appeals, just like in Magic, sporting parallel here, right? All right. So when we have these difficult to deal with players, how do we approach them, right? Couple tips for that. We mentioned the player disqualification FAQ. It's available on the Magic Judge blog site, provides an overview of the whole process, and gives them the contact information for people if they don't want to deal with you specifically, right? If they want to email their witness statement, they can do that, right? If they want to complain about a judge, perfect. Feel free to give them David Hibbs's information, things like that, right? Absolutely give them Hibbs's information, right? I find it helps that you emphasize that they are being removed from the event. It's like we talked earlier, it's a separate process from the investigation committee. Disqualification is purely for this event. Anything else from here on out is with the investigation committee. Emphasize that their statement that they're going to give you or to somebody else is going to approach everything else down the line as far as the suspension might be, right? If there's a lot of stigma that comes with a DQ, if we separate that so much from the initial event, that tends to calm people down, right? Also, smarter people than I, people good with psychiatry have realized if you physically separate folks, that can help ease some of the tension, right? If you see it's going to start getting hostile, you're going to have a lot of arguments, say, hey, tell you what, why don't you pack up some of your stuff? Let me go print out this player disqualification. I'll meet you in the back of the room. We'll talk through it there, right? Just having that physical separation and the 30-second separation from the talk can help calm things down quite a bit as well. If things get really belligerent, involve the TO. If they need to be removed from the store, that's fine. Give them that player disqualification sheet. Deal with all the paperwork on that side later, right? There we go. So some fuller tips, stress the ability for them to fill out their own witness statements, give them the chance. A lot of players feel, again, they hear in the head judge announcements that your word is final. Let them know it's only final for this DQ. They get somebody to appeal to basically beyond that, right? Highlight the other contacts on the FAQ. And unfortunately, a lot of the really difficult DQs don't end when the tournament ends, right? Word spreads very quickly. A number of us are vintage players. There was, I believe it was GP Louisville at the beginning of the year. There was a vintage side event on, I think it was Saturday. There was a disqualification, I think in round 1. About an hour later, I knew about it in Dallas. I didn't hear about it through the judge channel either. Word had already spread about that DQ within a round everywhere in the vintage community, right? Unfortunately, social media is the thing, right? You may think when you leave the tournament venue, this is going to be the end of it. The really bad ones, I'll let you know it isn't, right? How are we doing on time, Preston? I know we're about 5 minutes or so. Okay, thank you. All right. So know that that's going to be an issue possibly for the really belligerent ones. If you need to talk to other judges, know that you have that resource, right? You can talk to Hibbs. There's also a number of other judges that have been through this before, myself included. Josh has volunteered. Josh McCurley has been through a particularly difficult one. Jared Flight's also been through a rather difficult DQ. In some of the more complicated ones, I don't want to scare anybody off of this, there have been threats of legal action. There's been threats of violence. Thankfully, I haven't had my life threatened over Magic. I have had it in hockey coaching. There's been 2 games with death threats called in against me. I'm hoping that's never an issue in Magic. But again, all of this gets really serious. You don't have to deal with it in a vacuum. Find somebody to talk to. Hibbs, Josh, Jared, myself, happy to talk to you, right? When you do that, know that you can't discuss the very particular details of an investigation while it's pending. Yes, miss? So the question was, how can we deal with it if we're approaching violence or something of that level? If you're in a store, get the store owner involved. Number one. My kind of guideline, if it's something that's not acceptable outside of Magic, it's probably a bigger TO issue than, at that point, Magic's secondary, right? If there's threats of violence, to me, it's a store thing more than a Magic thing at that point. The sooner you can involve the store owner / TO, the better. Josh, did you have something to add to that?
Yeah. Like, so if every time I've done a DQ, I tell the TO and the store owner before I pull the trigger. That way they know, and typically they're there in case things go wonky.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
If you're at a large event, the quickest way to get attention is to yell judge yourself as loud as possible.
Yes.
Because room full of 40 judges, all of us will stop.
Yep. Yep. Yeah. It's the better equivalent, yes. Recapping what Josh said, if you need to grab people immediately and you're in a large tournament, yell judge, people will come by immediately to help you, right? Yeah. Right. One final point as far as outside and after the tournament. I'm not much of a social media person myself. I would avoid social media for a good while if you're involved with the DQ. At least in the Dallas area, there's a rather avid Facebook group that tends to lighten up as soon as there's anything judge-player interaction-wise. I advise staying completely away from all that if you don't already. So, overview of what happens after you enter the DQ. We've already mentioned the investigation committee. It's a group of judges from around the world, and the reason they pull people from around the world is it's sensitive as a group to cultural differences, especially as far as misconduct goes, right? Certain cultures will treat things differently. What might be good in one area might not, might be acceptable elsewhere. So they're kind of sensitive to that and can handle those biases. They do have a rubric for common issues, and like penalty X, or infraction X is resolved with this, warning letter. This penalty will get a 3-month suspension, and then they adjust as necessary for special circumstances, right? The investigation committee may contact the head judge, players, other witnesses, information that they need it. In the roughly dozen DQs I've done, I've been contacted twice for more information. One had no impact. One ended up with the lessening of a penalty, which was fine. That full investigation committee process takes about 8 to 10 weeks. While that's going on, the suspect person can go ahead and play in other events. In the rare case that they're qualified for a pro tour or something of that level, they need to talk to WotC Premier Play as soon as possible. Let them know, hey, by the way, I got DQ'd. Should I fly to Kyoto? Unlikely to happen, but just be aware. Anything other than that, they're welcome to play in until the review is complete, right? When the review is complete, if they have their email system, either email address in the system or in WotC's account, they'll get a letter with the outcome when it's all done, right? So now, talking about why it's important to enforce DQs. Hibbs went on this a little bit. It was kind of a crux of the first couple questions we had, right? Here's our example of a referee looking the other way. Hockey, sports thing, don't worry about it. That's actually not his job to enforce that penalty, but don't worry about that. So, later in my life, thanks, I was a hockey coach. For 6 years, I coached McKinney, suburb of Dallas, their varsity hockey team. You can tell it's a long while ago. It's a newspaper clipping. I had hair. Not as much as Chris's sweet mullet, by the way, but we'd like to get back there someday. So a couple stories from hockey that can be somewhat relevant, right? We had a rival school. You play about a 24 game long season, single elimination playoffs, about 3 playoff games to determine who gets to go to state. One year we play our rival. Without knowing too much about hockey, don't worry about it. It's 3 periods. You switch ice each period, switch ends of the ice just like you would in football. First period, they score 3 goals. We're down 3-0. Second period, we score a goal about 5 minutes in. We're feeling great, right? Linesman goes, referee's pulling the puck out of the net, finds another puck in the net. The rules very specifically say a goal can't be scored if there's more than 1 puck on the ice, right? Clearly stated rule. Well, we kind-mannered coaches had a discussion with the referee. That's the same net that they scored 3 goals in last period. So how did that second puck get there and not affect those 3 goals? long story short, too late. They disallow our goal. They allow the other 3 goals because there's no way to know that the puck got in there at that point in time. Some of us think their goalie might have snuck it in there, but anyway, clearly written rules, the referees enforce them, right? Next year, we end up losing that game, by the way. Next year, we meet those same rivals in the playoffs again. Not to say we're being vengeful or anything like that. We tried to check on a rule. Hockey coaches have certification, much like judges do, right? Before I was a level 2 Magic judge, I was a level 3 hockey coach. Our rules, in general amateur hockey rules in the U.S. say you have to have at least one level 1 judge, or coach, I'm going to screw that up all the time. You have to have at least one level 1 coach with their credentials behind the bench whenever you have a game, right? It was important enough in our high school league that they had word for word those same rules in our high school bylaws, right? And not only did they have that, they said if you don't have it, your team can't take the ice, they forfeit the game. During warm-ups, we challenged our rivals. Like, do they have their credentials? It was fun to see the referees all go over and see their coaches rifling through their wallets looking for their cards, right? None of them had their credentials. Okay? Referees, being a playoff game, their supervisor was in the stands. They go and talk to their supervisor. Again, long story short, too late. They don't enforce the penalty. They let the game go on. Our rivals end up winning the game, right? That's that. So who feels bad in this situation, right? The referees didn't enforce the penalty because in their eyes, it was an issue with the coaches, not the players of the rival team, right? If we don't let them play, it's not fair to them, right? From an outside perspective, or at least our coach's perspective, right? If you don't enforce the rules that are there, you're hurting you're hurting those who follow the rules, right? And why have the rules written down and have an actual verbatim penalty that you give when it happens if you're not going to enforce it, right? That all ties into, again, why it's important to enforce our DQs. Some things like rolling an eye may not seem like it's something you should remove somebody from a tournament for. It's important for us as judges, if we have philosophical differences, deal with this separately. We have verbatim rules. We need to enforce them, right? Keep it fair. We have to apply everything equally. If you choose not to enforce the rules, it's going to have a bad impact on the judge program, the store, the TO you're working with, and yourself personally, right? When I first moved to Texas, we had some issues. There were some stores running drafts that you try to avoid because you heard of a reputation that the store owner's buddy. Every time after drafting, he'd go to the bathroom, come out 5 minutes later with an awesome deck, right? People stayed away from those stores because of those types of reputations, because the stores would look away. Thankfully, the last couple of years, we don't seem to have those problems. But again, word travels quickly, right? More so, it can affect the WPN status of the TO. If Wizards finds out that they're not enforcing the rules, it can affect them, right? So dealing with those difficult TOs who don't want to enforce these things, sometimes this comes up for minor issues, just like rolling dice. If the players are regulars at the store, if they have a large group of friends, or if they're good friends of the owner, the TOs may not want to enforce these penalties, right? So when we have those difficult discussions, remind the TO we've got a strong set of rules. That's why Magic's one of the best games out there, right? We need to judge them with common enforcements, right? If we look the other way, in my experience, it's going to have bigger ripples on attendance than if we just end up removing that player and they never come back, right? People avoid stores with bad reputations, right? There can be a good confidence boost when people see that you're enforcing the rules. In that pre-release example I gave, there was one of our PTQ grinders who was there. Hasn't talked to me in 15 years, but at that one point, the one time he did talk to me, gave me a pat on the shoulder, said, hey, I know giving those folks a DQ was a tough thing, but it's the right thing to do, right? People do actually notice the good things in the enforcement, and it can help drive up things. Again, if the TOs are having any kind of difficulty, suggest that they talk with other judges, other store owners, or the WPN rep for more info. Right? Wrapping up, if you got questions, talk to anybody else out there. Talk to the area captain, talk to Hibbs, Josh, myself. We're all happy to help, right? We do this to protect the integrity of our game, keep things fun, keep things fair, right? With that, questions?
Another interesting situation happened at a local store. It's draft went around, went a pack, and I'm not judging the event, and I see after
Right.
I got to talk to him about it, and about the store owner told him to do it.
Okay. Yes. How do you handle that, right? So first thing you do, you're probably grabbing a bottle of alcohol or whatever your chosen method of pain relief is after the event. But no, and this has happened multiple times in other types of situations where a tournament official and the TOs or store owners are effectively tournament officials, right? If a floor judge, if a store owner goes and gives them direction to do something, we shouldn't be penalizing them for it, right?
Yeah, they had no idea.
Right.
But
Yeah.
what should I do at that point, though?
Right.
In terms of
You need to talk. Well, I'm sorry. Yeah. So the question, so what do we do to talk with the store owner? Kind of these same slides here, right? Show, if you have access to a computer, show them where it's not allowed, show them where there's a penalty, and say, hey, this is something we can't be doing. If it's going to be a broader picture thing, try to find, have a good, heart, solid discussion about it. Yes.
We have a player who can speak, which is known as not speaking.
Okay.
And he plays in a ton of events, but he doesn't speak. And a lot of people come to me and they're like, hey man, I just don't know what he's doing, but I'm pretty sure he's been cheating. And he just doesn't say anything, and I don't know what to say because he is XYZ to the store owner.
Okay.
But what do I do in that situation?
Mm-hmm.
Because he just doesn't say anything. And he never
Sure. So the question, if we have a player who's not as communicative as others, right? Biggest thing, so that if they're coming to you already suspecting the cheating, first thing I would do is encourage them to get you there as soon as it's happening, right? Because when they're there, the player needs to be answering your questions if there's not some other outside thing as to why they can't be answering the questions, right? I would strongly suggest trying to move all the discussion of cheating as close to the event of it actually happening as possible, right? There's not a whole, that's the biggest thing to do. If it happens after the fact, I might have a discussion with that player who's not being as talkative, saying, hey, I see you don't talk much during your matches. That lack of communication is causing some people to question some things that's going on. Okay. Okay. Oh. Right. So as far as time goes, shoot, frankly, it's a question I don't have a great answer to now, and that's probably a good discussion point outside of here. Yep. Time-wise, I've lost track with our rescheduling. Are we about ready to shift over the room? Okay. So appreciate it, folks. I know we had questions kind of all throughout, so the wrap-up questions weren't quite as much time. Appreciate everything. If you got anything outside, please come and catch me. Thank you.